This is the Mike LiPetri Show. We're all good. You ready to go with me, baby?
I'm ready to go.
Larry Levy, thank you so much for your time. I've been super excited to get you on. A big thing is where you're just a wealth. For Long Island, you are a wealth of experience and knowledge. For those who don't know, Larry Levy is the Executive Dean of Suburban Studies for Hofstra University and Vice President of Economic Development Professional Studies, with 35 years as a reporter, editorial writer, columnist, PBS host, radio station you were on.
Yeah.
What else am I missing?
I don't know. This sounds like a backdoor way of saying I'm getting pretty old.
Or a very wise man.
Well, I'm not so sure wisdom and age necessarily equate, but I definitely have seen a lot of things. I've gotten to know a lot of people. And occasionally when I see something that's happening now and people are all in a tizzy, I can say, it's not the first time this has happened, and it turned out okay, or it didn't turn out okay, and give them the history and help them get some context and perspective. And I guess that's what older guys are supposed to do.
I think it's about setting up for the next generation, and we appreciate the path that you've paved for all of us. I mean, somebody has such institutional knowledge about the way politics and government works, and just frankly economic policies, and just how Long Island has been shaped over the decades. So the National Center for Suburban Studies.
Yeah.
You serve as executive dean on it. What is the primary purpose? For those who don't know, what is the primary purpose of the N.C.S.S. and where can they find what you provide?
Well, I can answer the second question much more easily. www.hofstra.edu/NCSS. I sound like a politician, giving his dollars website. www.hofstra.edu/NCSS. And if you want to donate, your dollars would be welcome.
Greatly
and it won't
appreciate
be put into a political campaign. The National Center for Suburban Study was the idea of the prior president, who decided that, Long Island is considered, America's first suburb. If you can argue whether it is or isn't, but it's an important place, a bellwether, not just politically, but economically, socially. What happens here is generally going to happen elsewhere eventually in a lot of other suburban areas. And a lot of people don't realize, even now, that the suburban voter around the country provides decisive votes for who controls the keys to the White House and the gavel in Congress. And there are now more poor people in suburban communities than in central cities. 60% of the people in the country live in the suburbs, and we are increasingly experiencing what used to be considered urban problems. You can argue about the reasons for the higher crime rate and the congestion, who's to blame. Well, we don't get into that. We just try to study problems, help suburban communities realize their promise economically, again, socially, and try to get in as many peer-reviewed journals as we can, and get as many consulting contracts with government agencies, not-for-profits, and private businesses. It's a hybrid. It began as a purely academic institution that focused on academic conferences and journals, as I said earlier. But as it became clear that there was more and more of a need for businesses, and again, not-for-profits and government agencies, to have a better handle on it, to work more efficiently in suburban communities, we had an opportunity to do that sort of work, and to do it with integrity, to do it with expertise and experience. So it's a mix now of, purely academic work, how many suburban angels dance on the head of a pin kind of thing, that I couldn't even explain to you because some of it's so complicated, to being the contractor to New York State, the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, to help produce the post-Sandy reconstruction plans in 8 Suffolk communities, to produce what's called social resiliency programs, educational curriculum. We're busy, maybe too busy, but it's never a dull moment because we're always doing new and different things.
Yeah, I think and many people aren't aware, and you touched upon it right in the beginning there, of how Long Island really is a microcosm for the rest of the country. In fact, many political pundits have also said that Nassau County specifically, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Nassau County is actually a microcosm and a bellwether for presidential elections because of the makeup among the demographics, the socioeconomic status, and also just the political backgrounds.
Right, and which means, and you're absolutely correct about that, which means that everyone from academic political scientists to political activists to folks who run political campaigns keep an eye on what's going on in Nassau. But there's an irony that I know you're aware of, and maybe some of the listeners and viewers are, that in presidential years, even though what happens in Nassau is reflective, in a sense, of a bellwether for the rest of the country, the vote generally doesn't count. And the reason is that we're a very blue state, irrespective of the relatively close gubernatorial race last November. We're a blue state, and if Nassau County votes heavily for a Democrat or a Republican, it's not going to change New York State. But it will tell you what's going to be happening in other parts of the country, particularly in the swing states where the suburbs will decide who gets those electoral votes.
Yeah, I think you saw that in 21 with the Nassau County Executive Race comparative to in Virginia, the gubernatorial race, how those two were very, very in sync, in parallel.
Very similar.
Yes, which is very unique, I thought, comparative to the rest of the country.
Yet, what happened in 2022 on Long Island made it an anomaly, completely unlike most suburban swing areas around the country. It was the unexpectedly good performance by Democrats in these suburban swing districts around the country that kept the race from being a total blowout against the Democrats. They still lost control, but 5-6 seats, depending upon what day it is, and what happens to George Santos. I know you want to talk about.
Absolutely.
It's a cottage industry for me as a talking head.
I can imagine, because I mean, and you're totally right about that. How it was one of those where it was consistent in 21 and then anomaly in 22. How the island, island voted.
Both parties, by the way, nationally, if you talk to people around the country engaged in politics, both parties are looking at Nassau and trying to figure out if there's something in what happened in November that could become part of a new playbook. I know, in fact, I think Ed Cox is the next Republican state chairman. Blast from the past, Richard Nixon's son-in-law, what we used to call the old white shoe Republican, Wall Street, North Shore, East Hampton. The party is looking to him to kind of pull it back toward the middle, to pull it away from a so-called MAGA only series of policies and style and substance.
Yeah, focused more so on the Republican issues than the Trumpism of who he is as a character. In the sense of politics, which makes it
come back to taxes.
Correct.
Inflation really is kind of like a stepchild of taxes as an issue.
Absolutely.
And it cut very, very well for Republicans here on Long Island. Crime, government spending, wherever you come out on it.
Now they're really talking about the CRT that hit hard in 21.
Right. Although CRT is an issue that didn't play well for Republicans around the country, interestingly enough.
In 22?
In 22, in swing areas.
Yeah, which was, why do you think that?
Because
21, it was so strong.
Partly it's the way it's promoted and the people most loudly promoting it. They come across, and I don't mean to get into calling people names. I don't do that. I wag my finger at people who do that. But a lot of the anti-CRT, and by the way, that's a whole other issue. Nobody in the Democratic Party of any stature is advocating for CRT, but they allowed the progressives, and this is the problem that Cox has with Republicans.
Right.
Democrat and Joe Biden let the Democratic Socialists, the so-called progressives, have the mic.
Yeah, they basically
have the
hijacked
forum.
it.
Exactly, and Biden was able to pull it back in 2020. He's going to have to do it again in 2024. But suburban swing voters, they're moderates. They care very much about their communities. We'll talk about the Hochul plan and why there's so much pushback on the housing issue. They're uncomfortable with people who seem to be extremists and calling people names. I'm trying to avoid the word racist, but some of the people who are pushing back against things like critical race theory come across as a little racist, a little insensitive. I mean, when Black Lives Matter first emerged, there was enormous support, both in polls and on the street, from Volvo moms, soccer moms. You had them attending marches in favor of this. And it felt good to be able to take a stand that was kind of moderate and sensitive and inclusive. And the hyperbole coming out of a lot of the Republican or MAGA Republicans on this just made them really uncomfortable. AOC makes them uncomfortable. Marjorie Taylor Greene makes them uncomfortable.
Well, extremism on any side, right?
Exactly.
That's what it ultimately is about.
Suburbanites. I mean, we have extreme left, extreme right out in the suburbs, obviously, but the predominant voice, the predominant ear on Long Island tends to shy away from extremism of any stripe. You're absolutely right about that.
I think that's what the people are yearning for, is that common sense approach that's be focusing on that kitchen table issues of what's going to affect my life, what's going to make my life easier, where I can put more money in my pocket, I can do more for my children, for my wife, for my husband. That's what they ultimately want, because at the end of the day, people, they want to live a great life. They want to have fun, enjoy themselves, and do the best they can to leave their kin off in a better position than they were when they were at that same age. So I find it so interesting. I mean, you and I can go back and forth on this, but you touched upon it. The Hochul housing plan. Yeah. You're hearing it in the news. Everyone's talking about it.
800,000 new units in a certain number of years. Hundreds of millions of dollars to help villages that want to move forward.
Right.
But the town supervisors and the village officials don't like the but.
Right.
The but, which is, if you don't get this done, you could you could have your zoning powers overridden. What's
right. And
fascinating?
Let's break down exactly what that plan is. So
sure. Yeah.
You're including these are the policy changes. So people they're hearing this, but they're not really hearing. It's all municipalities across the state. Governor Hochul hits a new housing construction target, opening a $250 million infrastructure fund, a $20 million planning fund to help support housing construction, speeding up projects developments, creating a new tax incentive for building affordable housing to replace the 421A, which expired last year.
Right.
The rezoning areas within a half mile of train stations for increased residential development, and then New York City and the surrounding areas that are served by the MTA's commuter rail lines will have to build new units at a 3% rate every 3 years. So that's in a nutshell.
Like a 1% a year, basically. So if you have 1,000
1%
homes,
every year,
you should shoot for 1,100. Well, here's the irony here. Here's what's so frustrating for people who want to see progress, real progressives. People don't talk about it, don't scream about it, don't tweet about it, but really want to see it happen. And progress requires working with people who don't always think like you. The irony here is that when I started out, you read my list of being a journalist 1,000 years ago. When I started out on Long Island in the 70s, you couldn't have a rational conversation with anybody about building affordable homes, apartments, except in a very few municipalities. And over the years, however, a consensus has emerged, Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, that we desperately do need more affordable housing. We need, and that if it's going to be built, it ought to be around the train stations. No argument here. And if you talk to some of the advocates who keep score, more and more villages, not enough to meet the need, not at a pace that's going to meet that need, but more and more villages have plans that are proceeding. They are likely to come to fruition. It's the sticks of this proposal, which has carrots and sticks, that is the problem. When you tell suburbanites, and there's an expression, all politics is local, Mike.
Yeah, of course.
Well,
Classic.
in suburbia, all politics is very, very local. And people move out here because they want, in a sense, more control over their lives. They want more personal security, whether it's financial or actually physical. And they move to small villages often because they want to have the people in charge closer to them. They can literally reach out and touch them at a village board meeting.
Of course, the mayor you could talk to,
Right.
and you're helping shape the character of the village that you live in.
That's right. And at the same time, suburbanites have a disproportionate amount of their wealth invested in their home and in that property. And anything they perceive, right or wrong, right? I can bombard people with facts and say you shouldn't worry about that. But whatever they perceive that might damage the value of that property or diminish their control over what might be affecting it is anathema. And I think that if Hochul had simply come out with the carrots,
Right.
she would have had a parade of people behind her, some in elephant suits, some in donkey suits, maybe even a couple of MAGA people if they still have their kids in the basement.
Perhaps.
And and I think that there are enough villages that want to do it, as George Bush said during Iraq thing, a coalition of the willing. There are plenty of villages that would have signed up. You wait 3 years, and you see how it went, and if it doesn't work, and then you get reelected, and you are in a stronger position, because right now politically she's in a relatively weak position. You then consider the sticks.
Because the state, see, the thing is and the sticks are, for those listening and watching, this housing plan, you're having the state that will usurp the local zoning
Yes.
from the towns. And can we elaborate on that? Can we talk about that exactly?
Right. So right now, if you're a developer and you want to build something that the zoning regulations don't permit, the zoning says 8 houses per acre, single family, nothing above 2 stories.
Right.
But you have a parcel of land that you think is appropriate to build a townhouse, 3 stories, 2 stories, but much denser, 20 units to that acre. You need to get a change in the zoning regulations to allow you to go forward. Very hard to get in suburban villages. What the proposal would require is that villages had to rezone the area, and you mentioned this earlier, around within half a mile of train stations, which are considered transit-oriented development zones. There's no argument that this is where, if you're going to do it, you should do it. But the proposal goes on to say, if you don't do this and you don't build a percent a year or 3% after 3 years, we can come in and say, no, you can't block this. We will rezone for you. And that will get people who otherwise would support affordable housing projects to say, no way, no how.
Right.
Or hell no way.
Because why do you want Albany dictating what your community looks like?
Well, I mean, I can make a case, for a lot of times where you might want Albany to come in and dictate if a village or a school district is completely out of control, however you define that, right or left. And I could make an argument that the need is so great that if there were no villages, no municipalities meeting this need, maybe a higher power had to step in. And legally, villages and towns are creatures of the state government. And people don't understand that. School districts are creatures of state government. So the state does have these powers. The state could arguably collapse all the school districts into one big one like you have
in the city.
Well, in the city, most suburban areas are countywide school districts. But just because you have the power doesn't mean you should use it, especially politically, because you'll just engender a backlash. And one of the concerns amongst even some housing advocates, if you talk to them quietly, is that the Hochul proposal, instead of speeding up the number of units in play, will slow it down for reasons ranging from everyone waiting to see how this plays out before they move forward, how much money is going to be available, how fast they're going to be able to do it, to whether villages will start to say, you know what, we were willing to consider this stuff because it makes a lot of sense, but you know what, forget about it. We're going to fight it. We're going to sign on to the lawsuits that inevitably will happen. And in the end, you get fewer units.
Right. And
that's the concern.
And there are questions that are raised about the constitutionality of this. So in your
yes. And when you start talking about constitutionality, you're talking about long legal cases.
Right.
And you always get a temporary restraining order.
Right.
And everything gets frozen.
And then when that
Who the hell needs that?
Correct. And that goes to exactly what you're talking about with many developers and businesses that are looking to grow the housing. If they have uncertainty, no one wants to invest their money into units that may never be made.
That's right.
Or be made several years. And now what? They're going to hold the land and still have to pay the taxes on it, et cetera.
So the question is, what's going to happen here?
Right.
And I know the folks are pushing back and hoping that anything from it goes away completely, which is not going to happen,
right, to
there are modifications along the lines of what I was talking about. Let's just throw the
carrot.
Carrots out. Don't take anything away from anybody else. Let's see how that works. And if it works, find out how you can continue to incentivize or incentivize even more so. And then you start to talk about sticks. What I privately, when somebody asks me my opinion, whether advocates or developers or political people who still occasionally reach out, I say, be real careful here, because the New York City Democrats, and I'm not making them into bad people, but the New York City Democrats basically have a supermajority in the state Senate. The progressives have a supermajority in the state legislature. And they got there losing all these Democratic seats on Long Island, i.e., they look out here and say, we don't need these people.
Right.
And they have affordable housing is even higher on their priority than the Long Island Regional Economic Development Council, the Long Island Association. And they could say, you know what? Let's do it in 1 year. Let's have them throw more sticks, require more housing than realistically can be digested out here. So be careful what you wish for, because the people in charge are not very sympathetic to your, what they would consider whining about doing what they know is the right thing to do, which is meet the need for young people, young workers who businesses need to grow, So how this plays out is going to be fascinating. And Governor Hochul, if she decides to go down the middle and split the difference between the people opposing and perhaps progressives who want to even do more, she can be overridden. She can be overridden by supermajorities.
And that's what's going to be very interesting. Exactly that is that use of the supermajority. Will they actually override the governor if she does, hypothetically, if the state legislature agrees on their own budget and the governor does not sign off, then they have the power to then veto override, and they just shove it down the people's throats, and whatever it is, it is.
Legislatures, even when they, especially when they are of the same party as a governor, they may vote against him or her in this case, but overriding a veto is something that happens very rarely.
When was the last time even the legislature used that supermajority?
I think it did happen once or twice with Andrew Cuomo, who was a very strong governor. But she is not, by winning by only 5 or 6 points in a state where Democrats outnumber Republicans at least 2 to 1, maybe
Correct.
more. Yeah. Her lack of coattails cost a lot of local Democrats their seats.
Right.
And the legislature may see her as a wounded beast and may be more likely to try to flex their muscles and do things that are usually not done, like override a veto of a governor of their own party.
Yeah, the political landscape is going to be very interesting over these next several weeks, and something that's going to be something that you and I are going to be watching very closely.
Sure.
Now, something that we talked about.
Don't you miss Albany, Mike?
Yeah. Something that we spoke about was the words affordable housing. And I would love to talk to you about this because this is something that people constantly use, but no one has the same definition for. And I think that is so frustrating for the general public when they hear affordable housing because it differs based on who is speaking. So it differs based on the speaker's understanding. So I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
Well,
what is affordable housing?
There are
Because what's affordable, right?
There are legal definitions. I mean, depending upon the kind of project you want, depending upon the level of subsidies you want from various government entities, you have to do. It's defined as a percentage of area median income. Okay. So there's housing for people at 120%. There's housing for people at 100, 80, 60. Even on down below that. Most affordable housing projects are between 80% and 120%. That's my experience. And if someone wants to call and say I'm off, I'll accept that. But affordable was a phrase that advocates came up with because housing projects, the word housing project didn't work. Subsidized housing didn't work. Right. They wanted to appeal to the notion that there are a lot of people who can't afford to live here, and so that includes the sons and daughters of people who own single-family homes, whatever their color is. It's still unsatisfying because it still allows, and we should have a contest for a better name for it. Yeah. But it still allows somebody to say. To imprint on it, or like a Rorschach test, whatever they see on it. For some people, it's going to be, oh my God, we're going to be overrun by people who don't look like us, who don't think like us. If they tend towards a racist point of view, oh my God, we're going to have all these black people in our community. And for other people, it's, well, wait a second. I paid X number of hundreds of thousands of dollars for my home. I have no objection to anybody, I don't care what their race is, coming into my home and paying market rate for it and observing the local rules, like don't rent out the basement to somebody else because you really can't afford to live there. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with people coming in who haven't earned their way here. I think that's pretty short-sighted. I think there's plenty of evidence. Oh, and then of course there's turn it into New York City with high rises. There are a handful of places on Long Island where anybody was even talking about what anyone would call high rise. Mineola, which is turning out pretty well in the downtown. Jack Martins, who's a Republican state senator, when he was the mayor, he said, we got a big hospital here. We got county government. We can go higher. We can go denser. We can bring in a lot of tax-paying people here. And I remember Republican leaders whispered in his ear and say, Jack, do you want a future? If you back high-rise apartment buildings in our village, you're going to get stampeded out of office. Turns out he won by 65% the next time, went on to the state Senate, still has a future, could be a Congress member of Congress someday, because he had the courage, he had the foresight. Right. Same thing in Patchogue with, oh gosh, I'm having one of those moments. The mayor of Patchogue, Paul Pontieri. Thank you, Larry. Paul Pontieri, same thing, a Democrat, said, we got to go higher. It's the only way we're going to get this village to come back. We got to bring in, hipper businesses. We got to bring in a entertainment venue, some breweries. Let's get a campus of one of the colleges out here. You go to downtown Patchogue, it's the poster child for suburban renewal. And it's only within a half a mile of the downtown and their train station. Doesn't touch any of the residential areas. And guess what happened? The values in the residential areas that didn't change went up as well because Patchogue had the reputation of being a hip place. Rockville Center, Huntington, again, Mineola, Farmingdale.
Now, and with all this, as the density of the populations increase on Long Island, what are your thoughts though of the ramifications it may or may not have on the drawing of the water from the aquifer, from the use of the energy grid, any increase in population in schools? What about those concerns that have been expressed as well?
Well, let me do schools first because
Okay.
we have participated in some research on that.
Yes.
And so did the Long Island Association and others who are not pushovers, and they're business people. Every credible study I've seen shows that apartments produce very few school students, so few that the additional taxes to the school district more than makes up for it. Okay. So schools is, this image of, oh my God, you're going to get these poor families with 9 kids inundating. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened, particularly in market rate or gently subsidized buildings. You also can control that by saying, look, we're not going to build three-bedroom apartments. We're going to do 1-bedroom. We're going to do 2-bedroom apartments for young workers who would prefer to just walk out the door, down the block, get on the train, go into the city, or go out to Babylon or Islip or something, the other direction on the LIRR. Now that we have the extra tracks and we have the capacity to do that. So extra school kids, that's just.
What about as far as the water and energy?
Okay, water is also not considered to be a problem as long as the sewage infrastructure is there. Okay. And one of the things
which is specifically more relevant with Suffolk County.
In both cases. I mean, Nassau County has a sewage system that touches most parts of its geography, but it's old. And right now, not far from where I live in Rockville Center, there's a huge project to upgrade the sewage capacity and to repair an aging infrastructure. Suffolk, has very little sewage.
Correct.
There's a whole history of that, which we can have to talk.
That'll be part 2
another day. Yeah. But now they realize that they have to do it, and the money is there to do it. The billions, the show Billions.
Yeah.
It could be about sewer building, right?
And then what about energy?
Paul Giamatti playing Steve Levy trying to build sewers.
Everybody. How many viewers do you think that's going to get? I don't know if that would get tons of sewers compared to Wall Street Finance.
Right. So as long as you have the infrastructure and you enforce environmental regulations, there should not be much of it. We're not talking about doubling, tripling, quadrupling the size of the population as we did in 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. We're talking about adding 5 or 10%. I mean, that's what we're talking about.
What does that equate to in the population, you'd say, for Long Island? If we have,
300,000 more people spread out over 100 miles.
Right. Okay.
At most. It really depends on how high people decide they want to go, how dense they want to be, what the demand is, what the politics are. Millennials and Gen Xers are much more supportive of different ways of housing people, transporting people than old folks like me. Although my mother was a card-carrying socialist, so I guess I have some of that young people's.
You still got a little bit.
So that's some of that young progressive stuff in my blood. I think the biggest potential, the biggest thing to worry about is, to my mind, and some people say this is not that big a deal, but I think it's important because small businesses and village downtowns really are the lifeblood of our economy. They don't seem that way because it's village to village. They're not that visible, but the impact on parking and traffic congestion in village downtowns. Now, the idea of building these, whether it's affordable or market, we need both affordable and market rate.
But aren't you passing in that respect? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's all right.
But aren't you also passing, in terms of the tax base, right? Now, aren't you passing off the cost onto the market rate by having the subsidized affordable housing portion?
Not if you look at the bigger picture. That now you're able to attract and retain workers who are essential to growing our knowledge-based economy, or even just being waiters and waitresses in our restaurants, and they will contribute to the economy far more than any subsidies.
Correct, but the direct impact on those taxpayers, right, on the property taxes you're having, if you had 50 units hypothetically, just doing numbers wise, and 10 of those units are paying a subsidized cost, but
but they're not. If the subsidy comes in the form of tax credits on that are paid by the value of the home. In other words, the building, and most of these buildings have 10%. Most of these buildings have 10 or 15% affordable units.
Right.
That's it. So the land that this building is going to be built upon right now is paying very little taxes at all. Without the subsidies, without to get it built. So now when it's 50 units, it's paying a lot more in taxes, which will cover whatever subsidies there are. And the amount of income taxes that these people will pay, the sales taxes that these subsidized people will pay, will more than make up for in whatever went into getting them there. Because we need them. If a business can't hire somebody, they can't expand. If they can't expand, they can't pay more taxes. They can't produce the products that create multiplier effects through the economy. I think it's overall, it's a good deal for a region that has ambitions to compete with the Silicon Valleys and compete with the Research Triangle in North Carolina.
And there's no reason we shouldn't because of the knowledge that we have
but
here.
We can't if when you're recruiting somebody out of Stanford or somebody out of MIT or somebody out of, or somebody out of Hofstra to go work in your business, and they say, well, North Carolina, they got, I'm not going to make as much as I'm in New York, but it's like it costs me half as much to live there.
Right.
They're not going to come here. But
those are also extra variables besides housing in that mentality at least.
Well, housing is an an important part of it.
That's an important part.
When we survey young workers here in, it's the cost of living, and the biggest single chunk of anybody's cost of living is what they pay in rent or mortgage. Right now, it's up to almost 35% of income. I mean, when my folks moved out here with the hordes of hundreds of millions, hundreds of thousands of people in the 50s and then the 60s and the 70s, you're paying maybe 25% of your income. Now it's 35 for lower wage earners. It's 50%. So if you're a young person, you've got your master's degree in chemistry, and you're looking for a job, and some of the big pharma firms out on Long Island want to hire you, and you've got college loans, and why wouldn't you go to some place that it's cheaper?
Right, the overhead is just way too much.
Yeah, Long Island, and so without having, I'm not advocating for company towns, like the big companies ought to build their own housing.
Yeah.
There are big companies that
which is a thought
that have explored that. Well, it gets very, very complicated. It creates liability issues.
And
What happens if somebody gets fired?
Correct.
You can't. How do you evict them?
I think it's just creative in the sense of the thought process where they're basically building their own.
But that's why
community.
That's why the Long Island Association supports, creating affordable housing. These are the largest chamber of commerce in the country.
Yeah.
Because they realize that it's an expensive place to live, and their businesses aren't going to build their own housing. So the next best thing, they're willing to, as big taxpayers, they're willing to see some of their tax dollars go to subsidize housing.
To build.
And you know what? The newcomers become part of the social fabric too. They become members of the fire department. They become volunteer auxiliary police officers. They become Little League coach. I mean, it's as well as creating the multiplier effect of buying food, and I think that's the reason why shrewd business people support these programs. 25 years ago they didn't. 30 years ago they didn't. They just saw it as wasteful because Long Island was just growing by itself.
Right. Now
we weren't that expensive relative to other places. Mm-hmm. Now we are.
Yeah, so now it's going to be
Yeah.
this will be interesting to see how this develops. Before we conclude, I want to just talk for a few minutes. I know this has been amazing, and I want to just kind of touch upon what we talked about with the you mentioned in the beginning the Santos effect on local races.
Yeah.
We have some local races now
Yeah.
coming up. All the town and county on the ballot, county ledge. In Nassau County, it's the county ledge. It's the town races, supervisor, town council races.
Right.
In Suffolk County, it's the Suffolk County Executive Race.
Right.
It's the ledge as well as the towns as well.
Right.
So what is the effect, if any, that this whole just controversy that George Santos created?
One of the worries
what's that doing?
Local Republicans are worried that 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 voter anger over George Santos, who was the Republican candidate and victor in the 3rd Congressional District,
Which makes up
will
North
engender
Hempstead, town of Worcester Bay.
mostly the town of North Hempstead, and that will engender a backlash the first chance those voters get. Even though Jennifer DeCina, the North Hempstead town, did she support him? Yeah, I mean, you can twist that into a message, but the reality is Republicans support Republican candidates, Democratic candidates. She didn't work hard for him, but she's the elected Republican supervisor, and she is in a town that has more Democrats than Republicans, and she is really worried that voters are angry at the local Republican Party, and the first chance they get, they will vote against any Republican they can see. We saw that in 2021. Laura Curran, popular county executive, Democrat, known to getting crossover voters, had a 24-point lead back in, according to the Republican leader Joe Cairo, in March or April of the year she ran. And the problems over bail reform and some other issues that ignited Long Islanders, they took it out on any Democrat they could.
But are we conflating policies versus the person? Because in this respect, you have George Santos, who he personally lied about everything.
Right.
But in this context, with the Laura Curran situation, was the bail reform. You had the situation where the Glenn Youngkin with the CRT issues came out. Then you had Afghanistan withdrawal that Joe Biden did. So these were policies that were attributed then to and blamed for
Right,
Laura.
but had nothing to do with Laura.
Right,
that's
they're
what I'm
blaming
saying.
on Laura.
Well, right, and Jennifer DeCina, didn't have anything to do with picking.
Yeah, she didn't.
George
She
Santos.
called him to resign.
But she was on a stage. She went to events, and I'm saying this has nothing to do with her.
Right.
Has nothing to do with any of the
So
Republicans.
you think that's going to be attributed?
Well, I don't know. I said that's something we're definitely going to look at, and I know Republicans are worried about this.
Yeah.
Because the Democrats, whether it's fair or not, it's smart to try to hang whatever you can around the neck of your opponent,
politics ever
make
fair?
them pay for it. Right. We know it's very, very local. That's
yeah, exactly.
so we're looking. People are looking at it. I mean, I think that Suffolk it's a little far removed from this.
Right.
But I think the town of Hempstead candidates are strong incumbents who have a strong organization working for them. They're concerned, but it's really North Hempstead.
Yeah, North. And then impactful in the legislative races too over there.
And in the legislative races in the town council and town supervisor race.
Now juxtapose Suffolk County. Suffolk County had that whole cybersecurity breach.
Right.
How much do you think that's going to play into the county executive race in Suffolk?
My gut tells me that for some reason, the cybersecurity thing is not going to have a political cost on anybody. I think it's too complicated and it's the kind of thing I could be wrong. And if
this is your opinion,
nobody's
right?
Well, it's just my gut's telling me and talking to people on the street. I don't hear anybody talking up, boy, those Democrats, they really screwed up our cyber. People don't understand.
Data, yeah.
People say, this can happen to anybody. It's really bad. It's too bad. What did he do to fix it? Okay, he moved to fix it.
Yep.
I wasn't happy. But I think people sort of understand that this is now happening. Everybody's grappling with these sorts of things. Even on your own laptop. So I could be wrong. I mean, is it the straw that breaks the camel's back? MTA payroll tax, Hochul proposal, inflation, bail reform. In that it was one more thing that just had somebody say, you know what? I'm tired of those Democrats. I usually vote Democratic. I'm tired of the Democrats. I don't like a lot of the Republicans, but this person's not so bad, you know. Have interesting, two very interesting candidates in Suffolk County Executive Race. You know, they're not bombastic people. One's a businessman who has a great reputation in public service, Dave Cologne. Ed Romaine is known as a green Republican. He gets MAGA votes, but he doesn't pander to them or anybody else. These are low-keyed, let's get the job done. There's no Republican way to fill a pothole. There's no Democratic way. And it'll be really interesting. And Cologne, and Romaine has the edge here because he's got a base of Brookhaven, which is the biggest land. But Cologne's going to have a lot of money to spend.
Yeah, town of Brookhaven has about, 500,000 people?
Not quite, but it's getting there.
It's getting there.
And it's one of the areas where there is a potential for growth because there's a lot of lands left.
And then on top of it, then you have Cologne, who's got, I think, 1.7 million.
Oh, before he's done, he'll find $5 million.
He'll have $5 million.
No doubt about it. I don't know that Ed Romaine gets $5 million.
See,
so I think it's going to be equal spend. I mean, I don't think he beats $5 million. I think you'll have equal spending. It'll be very interesting to see where how the national issues, because again, we were talking about this before, but what we've seen more and more often, that local races pitting candidates, incumbents, challengers who have nothing to do with the national or state issues getting swept away because voters are angry at a party because of stuff that has nothing to do with their own backyard.
And I wonder, what do you think that's due to? Has that been something that's constant over the decades, or is that
it's been it's been, yes, it's been constant. I remember back, and I was a kid then, but I learned that in 1964, for example, you had the gold backlash against Barry Goldwater, right? You had Lyndon Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater was considered a very right winger. Now he'd be a moderate, but he was a right winger. Johnson buried him, and with it, a guy named Joe Carlino, who was the Speaker of the Assembly from Long Island, lost his seat locally. He was swept out by just a revolt against the Republican Party for putting up a Barry Goldwater. And that happens all the time. I mean, I could probably give you half a dozen other examples if I thought about it and had a good cup of coffee.
Yeah, well, Larry, you are a man full of knowledge. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate all your time, and I look forward. We're gonna have to do a part two. Now we have to
do part two, and the only reason I schlepped out here to Hauppauge is sort of what we were talking about, implicit in some of the other things. I said, old guys like me have an obligation to help young guys like you who are interested in serving the public and being part of the discussion. Proceed along your mission.
Well, differing interests are the hallmark to a democratic society. Right. So thank you, sir. Appreciate it.